Voilà. Ça, c'est du gaz de broussaille. Et ça, c'est de la lumière de broussaille.
Imagine a world where energy isn't powered by coal, gas, or expensive technology, but by something as simple as a pile of rotting wood. What if the solution to our growing energy crisis has been hiding in plain sight all along? A man living in a quiet forest discovered a secret buried under decades of industrial convenience. He tapped into nature's forgotten power, heat, fuel, and electricity, all from decay. Yet, despite this groundbreaking invention, the world turned its back.
And we threw a bunch of green stuff on top and kind of mixed it in the top layer so it all seeps down. And we watered it in very well. And we basically tarped it and capped it like a large bag. And I used an old piece of poly to catch all of that methane because it will rise up through a normal tarp.
What happened to the man who could have changed everything? In the early 1970s, deep in the forests of southern France, something remarkable began to unfold. It wasn't the latest scientific breakthrough or a cutting-edge invention. Instead, it was a simple observation made by a forester named Jean Penn, who was managing a vast tract of land. Jean had spent his life working with nature, but this particular discovery would change his approach to the land he cared for, and it would go unnoticed by the world for many years. Jean wasn't looking for a new energy source when he made his discovery. He wasn't trying to solve a pressing global issue, nor was he attempting to invent something that would change the course of history. He was simply storing brushwood. Like any forester would, he had a large amount of chipped wood gathered in piles to keep it out of the way. This was an ordinary, everyday task. However, what happened next wasn't ordinary at all. Days after the wood was piled up, Jean noticed something strange. The wood wasn't just sitting there, waiting to decay. It was hot, not warm, but decidedly hot. There was no fire, no engine, and no sunlight to explain the warmth emanating from the pile. There were no sparks or flames, no signs of combustion. The heat seemed to come from nowhere. Naturally, this caught Jean's attention, and he began to investigate. The more he observed, the more he realized this wasn't some freak accident. Each time he soaked the brushwood and allowed it to rot, the heat returned. It was consistent. It didn't fade away after a few hours, nor did it depend on the time of day. The pile of wood was generating heat in a way that defied the usual logic. At first, Jean couldn't make sense of it. There was no obvious reason why wood, when left to decay, would produce such a significant amount of warmth. But over time, Jean came to realize that what he had stumbled upon was something entirely natural. It was a biological process, one that had been occurring all around him without anyone noticing. What he had found was aerobic decomposition, a process in which microbes break down organic matter, releasing energy in the form of heat. It wasn't magic, as it initially seemed. It was biology at work. The more Jean observed, the clearer it became. He saw that as the microbes feasted on the dead wood, they weren't just breaking it down for their own benefit. They were releasing energy into the environment, and this energy could be felt. More importantly, it could be measured. It wasn't a fluke. It was a predictable, reliable process. The warmth was real, and it wasn't an isolated occurrence. Every time he repeated the process, the same thing happened. The wood rotted, and heat was produced. This realization wasn't just an intellectual curiosity. For Jean, it was a moment of profound insight. What if this heat could be harnessed? What if it wasn't just a quirk of nature, but a key to something far bigger? The possibilities seemed endless. Could this natural process be used to generate energy? Could it provide a source of warmth and power without the need for fossil fuels or electricity? Could this simple biological process offer a solution to some of the most pressing issues of energy scarcity? Jean wasn't a scientist. He didn't have a formal education in energy or engineering, but he was a deeply practical man, someone who lived closely with the land. He knew the value of patience and persistence. He had built his life on the understanding that nature could be a powerful ally, but only if you knew how to work with it. And here, in the decaying brushwood, he saw something extraordinary. At that moment, the idea began to form. What if he could take this natural process and channel it, control it in such a way that it could provide not just warmth but something even greater? Could he create an energy source that didn't rely on traditional fuels? Could he turn this biological process into something that could power his home, his farm, or even a larger community? Gene wasn't sure, but he was determined to find out. He wasn't motivated by fame or recognition. His goal wasn't to invent something that would make headlines or attract funding. Gene was a practical man. He simply wanted to find a way to live more sustainably. He wanted to reduce his dependence on outside resources, to make his life more self-sufficient and aligned with the natural world. The idea of creating an energy source that didn't rely on oil, coal, or gas was incredibly appealing. It meant independence, security, and a connection to the land that was more than just utilitarian. But Gene's discovery didn't just affect his thoughts on energy. It had a ripple effect across the way he looked at the land itself. As a forester, Gene had long understood the importance of managing his forest in a way that was sustainable. He didn't just want to extract resources, he wanted to care for the land so that it could continue to provide for future generations. This sense of stewardship was at the core of his identity. But now, with this new understanding of how nature could provide for him, he began to see the forest in an entirely different light. Gene wasn't simply managing the land. He was living in harmony with it, tapping into the natural processes that had always been there but had been largely ignored. The heat from the decaying wood was a byproduct of life, not a mistake or an anomaly. It was part of the circle of life, the natural cycle of birth, death, and renewal. And in this cycle, Gene saw the potential for something much more than just warmth. This was a system that could provide food, fuel, and even electricity, all without needing to rely on the industrial processes that dominated the modern world. He was beginning to realize that what he had discovered was a glimpse of something far bigger than himself. This wasn't just a process that could help him on his farm. It was a potential solution to some of the world's biggest challenges: energy scarcity, waste management, and environmental degradation. And yet, despite the vast potential of his discovery, Gene's name would remain largely unknown for many years to come. Gene's compost-powered heating system, the biomere, would later become his most famous invention. But the seeds of this idea were planted that day in the forests of southern France. And as he began to experiment with the natural processes at work around him, he would take the first steps toward creating a system that could change the way we think about energy, waste, and sustainability. What Gene had found in the heat of the decaying wood was a powerful reminder of the natural world's ability to provide. It wasn't about high-tech solutions or expensive machinery. It was about learning from nature and using the resources we already have in smarter, more sustainable ways. Gene's discovery was just the beginning of an idea that would evolve over time, and though the world wasn't ready to listen at the time, his work would continue to resonate for years to come. Gene Penn wasn't the kind of person to sit back and wait for change to come. His life was built around a deep connection to the land and a practical mindset that had shaped his every decision. When he first noticed the strange heat radiating from the piles of decomposing wood in the 1970s, it didn't take long for him to realize that he might be onto something significant. But for Gene, it wasn't just about the heat. It was about what that heat represented, the untapped potential of nature to provide for people in ways they hadn't yet realized. The discovery marked the beginning of a journey that would see him finding innovative, practical solutions to everyday problems, all based on the natural world. Gene's life in southern France wasn't one of luxury. He and his wife lived in a modest home on a tight budget. They had to be resourceful, making do with what they had, and this mindset had shaped Gene's approach to his land and his work as a forester. He wasn't one to waste resources, or simply follow the conventional paths laid out by society. Instead, Gene sought to live in a way that was both sustainable and practical, grounded in the rhythms of nature rather than the demands of industry. One of the early challenges Gene faced was how to care for his animals. He kept goats, and like most farmers, he needed bedding material for them. However, Gene didn't have the money to buy straw, a common bedding material. Instead of looking for a quick fix or an expensive solution, Gene turned to the land itself. He looked at the brushwood scattered around his property and realized that it could be chipped into small pieces and used as bedding for his goats. The result was better than he expected. Not only did the goats stay healthy, but the wood chips also proved more effective than the straw he would have bought. Gene didn't stop there. He understood that there was a relationship between the land, the animals, and the resources they used. The waste from the goats mixed with the wood chips created a kind of natural compost. This compost was not just a byproduct of the animals' presence, it became a valuable asset. Over time, Gene began to notice that the compost had a remarkable effect on the soil. The once barren dry earth on his property was beginning to change. The soil, enriched by the organic matter from the compost, was becoming richer and more fertile. This simple practice of using wood chips and animal waste led to the transformation of the land, and soon Gene's vegetable patch was thriving. Gene was amazed by the results. He hadn't expected such a dramatic improvement, and he was proud of what he had achieved. He grew enormous watermelons, towering tomato plants, and even managed to grow tropical crops like chayote in an area that by all accounts should not have supported such growth. The compost retained moisture, feeding the roots of the plants and helping them survive in the dry, sandy soil. The plants grew strong, healthy, and productive, with little need for additional irrigation. Gene's innovative use of natural resources had turned his barren soil into a thriving garden. At the time, Gene didn't know it, but the compost wasn't just improving his garden. It was a vital lesson in sustainable living. By using natural resources in this way, he wasn't simply solving one problem, he was creating a self-sustaining cycle. The waste from his animals and the decomposition of the wood chips wasn't just contributing to the soil's fertility. It was helping to close the loop on his farm's ecology, providing everything he needed without relying on outside resources. But life for Gene wasn't just about growing food. He also had to manage his forest, which spanned nearly 600 acres. Maintaining a forest is no small task. It requires time, effort, and careful planning to ensure that it remains healthy and doesn't become overgrown or vulnerable to wildfires. As part of his work, Gene had to clear dead or excess wood from the forest floor. This wood was often left to rot or was burned to clear space, but Gene saw an opportunity. He began chipping the excess wood and using it for the same purpose as the brushwood on his farm, creating more compost. In the early 1980s, the French government passed new wildfire prevention laws that required the creation of forest breaks to help contain fires. These laws meant that Gene was left with even more brushwood than he had before. Most people would have burned it or hauled it away to be discarded. But Gene wasn't like most people. He saw potential in that wood. Instead of burning it, he continued to chip it, soak it, and let it decompose. The process that had started as a simple curiosity about heat in the wood piles soon began to look more like a key to something far larger. With more and more wood available for decomposition, Gene's understanding of the process deepened. The heat from the rotting wood was becoming more reliable, and it wasn't long before Gene started to wonder whether this natural process could be harnessed for something more. Could this heat be used to power his home? Could it be used to generate electricity, provide warmth in winter, and even be used as fuel for other needs? This idea was far from a pipe dream. It was something that was already happening in nature, and Gene began to realize that he might be able to control and use it in a way that could benefit him and his family. But Gene wasn't just interested in harnessing the heat. He saw the potential for more. The system of decomposition wasn't just providing heat. It was also producing methane, a flammable gas that could be captured and used as fuel. This methane wasn't something that Gene had expected, but once he realized its presence, he saw it as another opportunity to expand the usefulness of his compost system. Gene wasn't a scientist. He didn't have the funding or the tools that many inventors have when they begin their work. But he had something that was even more valuable: curiosity, patience, and an intimate understanding of the land. He was connected to the forest in a way that allowed him to see what others missed. What he was building wasn't just an energy source, it was a closed-loop system that operated in harmony with nature, one that provided warmth, food, fuel, and even the possibility of electricity, all from something as simple as rotting wood. As Gene continued to develop his ideas, it became clear that this wasn't just about solving a few problems on his farm. He was creating a model for sustainable living, one that could be replicated in other parts of the world. But what made Gene's system truly innovative wasn't just that it provided energy. It was that it did so without the need for fossil fuels, without relying on industry, and without the pollution that typically comes with energy generation. Gene had found a way to live independently, to use the resources around him to power his home and his life. He wasn't relying on coal or gas or electricity from a grid. He had created something that was entirely self-sufficient, a system that worked with nature rather than against it. His compost-powered heating system wasn't just a curiosity, it was the beginning of a new way of thinking about energy, sustainability, and the relationship between people and the land. At this point, Gene didn't know exactly where his discovery would take him. But he did know one thing: the heat from the compost wasn't just a quirk of nature, it was an opportunity, a glimpse into the future of energy. And if he could harness that energy, he might just be able to change the way people thought about power, sustainability, and self-sufficiency. What began as an experiment born from necessity was fast becoming a revolutionary idea, one that would eventually lead to the creation of the biomere, a compost-powered heating system that would be unlike anything the world had ever seen before. But that was still to come. For now, Gene was focused on one thing: how to turn the heat from rotting wood into something that could power his home, and maybe even change the world. As Gene Penn's observations of the natural decomposition process continued to evolve, so did his ideas on how to harness the heat that was generated from the rotting wood. What had started as a curious phenomenon now began to take shape as a practical solution to a problem that many people faced: the need for energy. Gene's vision grew clearer with each passing day. The heat from the decomposing brushwood wasn't just a byproduct of nature, it was energy, real and usable. The question was, how could he capture that energy and put it to practical use? The answer came in the form of what would later be known as the biomere. Gene wasn't a trained engineer, but his practical experience as a forester and his deep connection to the land gave him a unique perspective. He knew that nature worked in cycles, and he understood the importance of efficiency in systems that interacted with the environment. Gene didn't want to create a system that required vast amounts of energy to operate or relied on fossil fuels. He wanted to build something that worked in harmony with nature, something that would provide energy without contributing to environmental harm. The idea behind the biomere was simple in concept: harness the heat generated by the decomposition of wood and use it to power a system that could provide heat and even hot water. But turning this idea into a functioning system required a great deal of experimentation, trial and error, and above all, patience. Gene started with a basic design, a rough rectangular pile of wood chips, but quickly realized that there was more to it than simply stacking the wood in any old manner. He needed to refine the design to maximize the heat retention and decomposition rate. Gene's first breakthrough came when he realized that shaping the pile into a dense circular mound improved both the heat retention and the speed of decomposition. The circular shape allowed the compost pile to retain heat more efficiently by reducing the amount of heat that was lost to the surrounding air. This small but significant change helped create a more consistent temperature inside the pile, which would become crucial in the development of the biomere. Once Gene had perfected the shape of the pile, he moved on to the next step, figuring out how to capture and use the heat. He came up with the idea of running a length of polyethylene pipe through the compost pile. By pumping cold water through the pipe and allowing it to pass through the decomposing wood chips, the heat from the pile would transfer to the water, effectively creating a low-tech but highly efficient heating system. Gene used around 650 feet of pipe in total, coiling it through the pile in such a way that it would be exposed to the most heat possible. When Gene tested the system, the results were astonishing. The water that emerged from the pipe was consistently heated to around 140 degrees Fahrenheit, enough to provide hot water for his home, and even heat the house itself. This heat wasn't just a temporary burst, it lasted for months, with no need for additional fuel or energy inputs. Gene was able to supply hot water and heat his 1,000 square foot home for up to 18 months, all from a pile of decomposing wood. What made this system even more remarkable was that it didn't require burning any wood or using any external energy source. It was completely self-sustaining. At this point, Gene began to realize the full potential of his discovery. The compost pile was more than just a heating system. It was a closed-loop energy source that provided multiple functions. Not only was it producing heat, but the decomposition process also released methane gas. This methane, which was typically considered a waste product, could be captured and used as fuel. Gene, ever resourceful, began to capture the methane in old truck inner tubes, which he used to power various devices around his home. The methane was enough to power a gas stove and even a generator. While the electricity output wasn't enough to power the entire house, it was enough to charge a battery bank and keep essential appliances running. Gene had, in effect, created a self-sustaining energy system that didn't rely on the external power grid or fossil fuels. The system was simple, efficient, and entirely renewable. But Gene didn't stop there. He wanted to ensure that the system was fully closed-loop. He didn't want any waste. Everything that was produced by the biomere had to be put to use in some way. As the compost pile decomposed, it didn't just provide heat and methane, it also produced nutrient-rich compost. Once the heat from the pile began to dissipate and the methane slowed, Gene scooped up the decomposed wood chips and spread them over his land. This wasn't just waste material, it was a valuable resource that could be used to enrich the soil. The compost helped to restore the fertility of the land, creating a cycle that supported both the forest and his farm. Gene's system wasn't just about heat or power. It was a holistic regenerative approach to living. The energy it provided wasn't extracted from the land in a way that depleted resources. It was part of a natural cycle that gave back more than it took. The decomposing wood that provided heat also turned into compost that nourished the soil, which in turn supported plant life. The methane that powered his stove and lights came from a waste product of the composting process, and once it was used, it was captured and turned into more compost, continuing the cycle. For Gene, the biomere was more than just a piece of technology, it was a way of life. He wasn't simply building a system to solve an immediate problem, he was creating something that could be sustained over time, something that worked with nature instead of against it. The biomere wasn't a quick fix or a short-term solution, it was a long-term commitment to living sustainably, to reducing dependence on external energy sources, and to restoring the health of the land. But Gene wasn't doing this for recognition or fame. He wasn't trying to create a product to sell to others. He was simply trying to live in a way that was in harmony with the environment. He was deeply connected to the land, and he wanted to build a system that reflected that connection. The biomere was the embodiment of his philosophy, sustainability, self-sufficiency, and a deep respect for the natural world. Gene's success with the biomere didn't go unnoticed. Journalists, scientists, and energy experts began to take an interest in his work. His innovative use of compost as a source of heat and energy was groundbreaking, and it caught the attention of many who were eager to see it replicated on a larger scale. In 1981, Reactor Digest * featured Gene and his invention, and his book on the subject sold over 100,000 copies. For a time, it seemed that the biomere might be the future of energy production, an eco-friendly, renewable energy system that was powered by nature itself. However, despite the attention, the biomere never gained widespread adoption. The reasons for this are complex. On the one hand, the system worked. It was clean, renewable, and sustainable. It provided heat, power, and even fertilizer, all from a natural process that could be replicated in any part of the world. On the other hand, the system required time, effort, and space, things that many people didn't have. The process of decomposing wood to generate heat and methane wasn't instant, and it required a certain level of dedication and patience. Unlike solar or wind power, which could be scaled up with factory-made systems, the biomere was a project that had to be built and maintained by individuals. There was no mass production model behind it, no supply chains or factories. It was a system that could only be built and operated by someone who was willing to put in the work. Jean Penn's invention, the biomere, may have faded from widespread recognition, but the principles behind it remain as relevant today as they were when he first started experimenting with compost in the 1970s. His system was groundbreaking in its simplicity and efficiency, harnessing the natural processes of decomposition to create energy. Despite its undeniable success, the biomere didn't fit into the modern world's fast-paced, industrialized systems. While the system was functional, renewable, and environmentally friendly, it required commitment, space, and time, things that most people, and certainly most corporations, weren't willing to invest in. It was this very factor that led to the missed opportunity. For a time, Jean's system garnered attention. Journalists, energy experts, and scientists visited his home in southern France to witness the biomere in action. Eager Digest * featured Jean in 1981, and his book sold over 100,000 copies. At that point, it seemed like the system might spread. The idea of using compost to generate heat, power, and even fuel was revolutionary, offering a small-scale, decentralized solution to some of the biggest energy challenges of the time. People began to see the potential for this technology to help reduce dependence on fossil fuels, lower energy costs, and create sustainable, local systems of power. Yet, despite the initial excitement, the biomere never became widely adopted. Why? The answer lies in the very nature of Jean's invention. The biomere wasn't designed to be a mass-market product or a commercially scalable solution. It wasn't built for profit or rapid growth. There were no factories behind it, no large corporations ready to invest and push it out to the masses. Jean's system was simple, local, and sustainable. It wasn't about creating an industry or a global supply chain. It was about creating a solution that worked on a small, individual scale. But in a world driven by convenience, speed, and mass production, this small-scale approach was a hard sell. The biomere required space, ideally, a hectare of forest, and tools to chip wood, time to soak it, and patience to allow the composting process to build heat. These were all qualities that modern society didn't have much of. People wanted quick, easy solutions, not systems that required hands-on effort. Solar panels and wind turbines offered convenience and scalability. They were technologies that could be quickly installed and plugged into the existing infrastructure. The biomere, on the other hand, required time, space, and dedication. It didn't come with a factory warranty, nor could it be purchased off the shelf. It was a system that needed to be nurtured and cared for by the people who used it. And as such, it never achieved the widespread adoption that solar and wind power did. Moreover, there was no billion-dollar industry behind the biomere to push it into the mainstream. Unlike solar power or wind energy, there were no massive factories manufacturing biomere systems, no global supply chains to support its expansion. The biomere was a one-man operation. It didn't offer the economies of scale that companies and governments looked for when making decisions about energy. The world, it seemed, wasn't ready for a solution that was small, local, and sustainable. It was too cumbersome for an industry that demanded instant gratification and massive scalability. But despite the lack of widespread adoption, Jean's work still offers a profound lesson. The biomere was a blueprint for self-sufficiency, for living in harmony with the land, and for creating energy without relying on industrialized systems that dominate our modern world. Jean's system wasn't about creating a big business or turning a profit. It was about using what nature provided to meet his needs and to help his family live more sustainably. It was a holistic system that provided heat, electricity, and fuel, all while enriching the soil and reducing the risk of wildfires in the forest. Today, as we face the mounting challenges of climate change, resource depletion, and environmental degradation, Gene's biomeer seems more relevant than ever. Energy prices continue to rise, wildfires grow more destructive, and the world struggles to find ways to reduce its reliance on fossil fuels. In many ways, the need for a system like the biomeer has never been more urgent. The world is looking for solutions to these problems, but the systems we've created so far, large-scale energy grids, centralized power plants, and massive infrastructure projects, often create new problems in the process. They come with high costs, pollution, and long supply chains that are vulnerable to disruption. Gene's system, on the other hand, offered a decentralized solution that was based on local resources, sustainability, and self-sufficiency. The beauty of the biomeer was that it worked with nature, not against it. The system used the natural process of decomposition to create energy, turning waste into something useful. The wood chips that were left to rot not only produced heat and methane, but they also became compost that could be used to nourish the soil. Gene's system was part of a closed-loop cycle that created energy, restored the earth, and provided fuel for cooking, lighting, and even transportation. The waste was minimal, and the energy produced was clean, renewable, and sustainable. But more than just providing energy, the biomeer was a reminder that true innovation doesn't always come in the form of flashy, high-tech solutions. Sometimes, innovation comes in the form of simplicity. The biomeer wasn't a high-tech machine or a cutting-edge invention. It was a system that worked with what was already available in nature. It was a reminder that sometimes the best solutions are the ones that have been right in front of us all along. In today's world, where we are increasingly aware of the need to reduce our carbon footprint and find more sustainable ways of living, Gene's invention seems to offer a potential answer to some of the most pressing challenges we face. The biomeer wasn't just about energy, it was about regeneration. It was about restoring the land, reducing waste, and creating a system that didn't just take from the environment but gave back to it. The fact that this system wasn't adopted on a larger scale is not a testament to its failure, but rather to the world's failure to recognize its value. What makes Gene's creation so remarkable is the fact that it worked. It wasn't a theoretical idea or a concept that needed refining. The biomeer was a working, functioning system that demonstrated the power of natural processes. Gene didn't invent a new technology or build something from scratch. He simply observed the natural world and found a way to harness its power in a way that was both practical and sustainable. His system didn't rely on rare minerals, expensive machinery, or complex infrastructure. It relied on what nature already provided: dead wood, microbes, and a little bit of patience. In a world that is increasingly focused on speed, scale, and profit, Gene's work serves as a reminder that sometimes the best solutions are the ones that take time, effort, and a deep connection to the land. The biomeer wasn't about convenience or mass production. It was about building a system that worked with the land and the resources available, creating something that was self-sustaining and regenerative. It was about creating a solution that was both local and scalable in its own unique way. Gene's legacy isn't one of corporate success or mass adoption. It's a legacy of innovation in the truest sense of the word, a reminder that sometimes the most revolutionary ideas are the simplest ones. In a world that's scrambling to find solutions to energy, waste, and sustainability, Gene's system offers a roadmap for a future that doesn't rely on big corporations or industrial processes. Instead, it offers a vision of a world where we work with nature, rather than against it, to meet our needs and restore the balance of the earth. And perhaps, in the future, the lessons of the biomeer will be rediscovered and applied in ways that can help us build a more sustainable and regenerative world.